Should we get started?
Sure, board member. We'll go ahead and get started with the housekeeping comments.
Thank you.
Thank you for participating in today's meeting. Please do not connect to Zoom or teleconference while in the room, and please silence all devices. Click on the globe at the bottom of your screen to select either English or Spanish. Public comment will be taken after each item. If you are in the auditorium and wish to comment, please use the iPads located in the lobby. For meetings in other locations, please complete a blue speaker card and provide it to a South Coast AQMD employee. Speakers may be limited to a total of 3 minutes or less for all agenda items, and times may be shortened to ensure all speakers can be heard. A countdown timer will be displayed on the screen for each public comment. More time will be allotted for Spanish translation that is not simultaneous. For questions or issues on public comment, please call the public advisor at 909-396-3247. That's 909-396-3247. Please adhere to the speaker time limit and treat others with courtesy, civility, and respect. Failure to do so can result in your mic being muted or you being removed from the meeting. Be aware that this meeting is being recorded. By participating, you are authorizing recording of audio and visual content presented during the live event and consent to subsequent use of the recording in the public domain by South Coast AQMD.
Is that it? We're ready?
Yes.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Ides of March 15th, 2024. I want to welcome everyone to the hybrid mobile source committee meeting of the South Coast Air Quality Management District. We've got different teleconference locations and in person, it looks like. I'm here in Los Angeles City Hall. Councilmember Rahman will be here shortly. So why don't we open it up if everyone can hear and do a roll call, please.
Mayor Pro Tem McAllen. Supervisor Mitchell.
Present.
Supervisor Perez. Councilmember Rahman. Councilmember Rodriguez. And Chair Krakow.
Present. Dynamic duo, Supervisor Mitchell and me. Good morning.
And I'm wearing my Lakers high tops for you when you aren't here, but you'll just have to believe me.
Darn it. Keep them in the closet for next time, okay? Good to see you. Should we wait for Councilmember Rahman, who I think is parking, or should we dive right in, Wayne?
We can dive right in.
Okay, very good, everyone. I believe. Hi. Okay, Councilmember Rahman is joining us. So that's a quorum, correct?
That's correct.
Great. Okay, so going through the agenda, everyone, we have 7 items today. 2 of them are informational items that we'll have reports on. The rest are receive and files. Any changes to the agenda before we jump in?
Board Member Krakow, I'm sorry to interrupt, but Supervisor Perez, we didn't notice your location. We were advised that you weren't going to be present, so unfortunately you won't be able to participate this morning.
Okay, I guess I'll just stand by.
Thank you, Supervisor.
Supervisor can listen in, correct?
Correct. You can listen in, Supervisor, just not be on camera or
Okay.
Zoom.
Sorry about that, Manny.
Yep.
So we can move him to the attendee side.
Yeah, not an issue. I didn't realize that I was going to stay back today after all, so it's all good.
Okay, thank you. We look forward to coming out to your neck of the woods for our retreat in May. It's going to be good. Okay, any changes to the agenda?
None.
Okay, we'll start then with item number 1. Again, this is an informational item. Another one of the many attainment issues that are coming to the committee this year. Update on South Coast AQMD, South Coast Air Basin Attainment Plan for the 2012 Annual Particulate Matter 2.5 Micron Standard. This presentation will provide an update on development of the draft plan for the 2012 annual PM 2.5 standard for the South Coast Air Basin. And I think we have a Deputy Executive Officer, Dr. Reese, presenting.
Good morning, Chair Krakoff and members of the committee. Thanks for that introduction. So yes, this is one of the many SIP elements that I'll be bringing back to Mobile Source Committee and to our board over the next couple of years. We won't be bored in planning to be, I think it's fair to say. Next slide, please. So the kind of overview of what I'm going to talk about today, we've developed a draft plan showing how we're going to be able to meet the 2012 annual PM 2.5 standard. This is specific for the South Coast Air Basin. We already meet this standard for Coachella Valley, and this shows how we're going to be able to meet that standard by the date required under the Clean Air Act. The good news is that the control strategy we've put together relies primarily on that we already have in place for the 2022 AQMD. NOx, again, is a very important driver of PM emissions, as it is for ozone. Our ozone control strategy is one on controlling NOx, and so those strategies are going to largely get us into attainment. We will need some limited additional controls for PM 2.5 and ammonia, but not what I thought before when I brought this plan to the committee earlier, where we thought we at that time might have many additional controls. We are planning right now to release the draft plan for public review later this month. Next slide, please. An outline more detailed of what I'm going to talk about today. First, I'm going to start off with a background on PM 2.5 and then what levels look like in the South Coast Air Basin. I'll talk a little bit about this precursor demonstration that we need to do. PM is both directly emitted as well as formed chemically in the atmosphere. Precursors are just the chemical building blocks that go into PM 2.5 formation, and there's some requirements that we have to follow under the Clean Air Act. I'll then talk about our strategy on how we're going to attain the standard, and then the next steps and public process. Next slide, please. So a little background on PM 2.5. It's particulate matter that's less than 2.5 microns in diameter. It's very, very small. You can see on the graphic here, comparing it to the size of a human hair, comparing it to the size of fine beach sand. It's incredibly small. We can't see it. And because it's so small, when we breathe it in, it goes deep into our lungs. It crosses through our lungs into our bloodstream. It crosses from our bloodstream through the blood-brain barrier. Because it can be so travel so much through our body, it causes a lot of health impacts. So it's very strongly linked to premature death, mostly from cardiovascular and respiratory health effects. So asthma, death, lung cancer, etc. Because it also gets into our brain, it can be linked to metabolic system issues, nervous system issues, cognitive issues, etc. So very, very significant health effects associated with this. And in fact, when we look at all air pollution, the health costs from PM 2.5 are much greater than all the others. When we monetize what those health impacts are, about 3/4 of it in our region is due to fine particulate matter. Next slide, please. Much like with ozone, there are multiple PM 2.5 standards. Today we're focusing on the one that's outlined in red here, which is a standard for the 2012 annual standard of 12 microgram per meter cubed. We're currently classified as being serious non-attainment for that standard. The official attainment date is the end of December 2025. We are allowed to get a 5-year extension under the Clean Air Act, and so we are targeting attainment in 2030. That's the current plan that I'm talking about today, but there are these other standards. So the 1997 annual standard, that's a standard of 15 microgram per meter cubed. We attained that. We met that back in 2013. For the 24-hour standard, from 2006, that's at 35 microgram per meter cubed. We're currently classified as serious non-attainment for that, but there's an asterisk there. Based on our preliminary data, we believe we currently meet that standard, and so we'll be working through that process. And then in terms of coming attractions, we have a new annual PM 2.5 standard that EPA just finalized, subject to some considerable news coverage. It's at 9 microgram per meter cubed. At that level, we'll both struggle to meet that standard, as well as many other areas in the country will be put into non-attainment for the first time. But that's a standard that takes effect in the future, so that's something that we'll be looking at over the coming years. Next slide, please. Okay, let's take a look at the PM 2.5 levels in the South Coast Air Basin. Much like ozone, this is a good news, bad news story in that we've come down in levels dramatically over the last 20 years. We've cut our levels by about half since we started measuring PM 2.5 data. The horizontal lines, those show the levels of the different standards. So the red line, 15 microgram per meter cubed, you can see we've met that since 2013. The orange line of 12 microgram per meter cubed, which is for the current standard, we're still slightly above that. And levels have in fact kind of leveled out over the last 10 years for PM 2.5. So they're still continuing to go down a little bit on that, but it's kind of stagnant. And right now we're about 14 microgram per meter cubed as our design value. And then the horizontal dashed line, that's the 9 microgram per meter cubed standard for the new standard. And you can see that that's going to be a pretty big leap for us to be able to meet. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, this is a plan that's addressing the 2012 annual standard. We're in serious non-attainment. That's the highest classification for PM 2.5 standards. You might remember in ozone, we're in extreme non-attainment, but for PM, there's only 2 classifications, moderate and serious. We're in serious non-attainment. We have some of the worst PM levels in the country in the South Coast Air Basin. I believe right now San Joaquin Valley beats us, but that's probably about it. And again, Coachella Valley attains this standard, so good news for Coachella there that this plan does not necessarily impact them. Next slide, please. Right. I've mentioned before that PM 2.5 is both directly emitted and then also formed from reactions of these chemical building blocks called precursors in the atmosphere. In fact, most of our PM 2.5 in our region is formed in the atmosphere. The main precursors that we discuss are oxides of nitrogen, so NOx, which you're familiar with from ozone, sulfur oxides or SOx, ammonia, and then volatile organic compounds, which you're also familiar from ozone. The good news here is that, strategies to reduce NOx that we take for ozone control will then also help us on PM 2.5. EPA requires when we go through our plans that we have to apply these planning requirements not only to direct PM emissions, but also look at it from the perspective of the precursors as well. So it's important that we consider these because precursors play such an important role in overall PM 2.5 concentrations. Next slide, please. So a little background on this 2012 plan. You might wonder why we're only now getting around to submitting this plan in 2024 when it was for a 2012 standard. And what happened was we actually did develop a plan showing how we were going to attain the standard back in 2016, and it was submitted to EPA in 2017. But unfortunately, EPA never acted on that plan. And then meanwhile, near roadway data, emission data became available starting in 2020. These monitors were installed, I think, in the 2015 timeframe. At the time that we developed our 2016 plan, there wasn't enough data from these near road monitors to consider. But because EPA waited so long to act on this plan, now the data is available. And the data is high. I mean, for one of our highest sites is at the near road monitor site by Route 60 in Ontario. And so at that point, EPA in 2020 asked us to do a supplemental demonstration, including those near road monitoring data. We didn't do it. EPA was eventually sued for failing to act on our plan. And then at that time, they informed us that they didn't feel that our plan was approvable anymore because it did not include these near road data. And so we withdrew that plan to avoid a potential disapproval that would have triggered sanctions. But that also means that we now have a clock by which we have to submit a revised plan by the end of December to avoid further sanctions. And so that's what we're doing here. Next slide, please. Okay, I mentioned the precursors before, this precursor demonstration that you have to apply the planning elements required under the Clean Air Act to all of the precursors. The Clean Air Act does allow you an out if you can show that a particular precursor does not significantly contribute to PM 2.5 levels. Depending on the atmospheric chemistry of a particular region, some precursors are a lot more important than others. And so you're able to waive those requirements if you can show that those specific precursors aren't very significant for PM formation. And based on our air quality modeling, it's really NOx and ammonia that these are significant precursors. And so that's what we're focused on. And of those two, NOx tends to drive a lot more of those emissions. So it's an important substance for us to consider. Next slide, please. So with that, our strategy to attain the PM 2.5 standard is largely to follow what we already have in place for NOx controls under the 2022 AQMD. That's a plan that requires massive reductions of NOx emissions over time. Those NOx emission reductions will drive lower PM 2.5 concentrations in our, we are looking at limited additional controls needed both for direct PM emissions and for precursors, but they're relatively minor in the scheme of things. Next slide, please. So when the strategies from our 2022 AQMP that we'll be looking to implement by 2030, which is the attainment date under the for this particular plan, it's again those strategies looking to transition to zero emission technology wherever feasible, pushing to the lowest NOx possible wherever not. We also are looking at our South Coast control measures on mobile sources, which includes our continued use of our incentive programs, as well as development of facility-based measures. And then CARB, of course, will continue to implement the 2022 state SIP strategy on mobile sources. Next slide, please. Can you go back one? Thank you. All right, so we also have to do this most stringent measures analysis. This is an analysis required under the Clean Air Act. It requires that we look at our rules and ensure that they're at least as stringent as any of those other rules that could be in other air districts or in other parts of the state. And so going through that analysis, we've identified 4 measures after combing through all of our rules and regulations that it looks like we need to implement, and these would have to be put in place by December of 2029. The first is on our Rule 445, which is our residential burning rule. We currently have an exemption for low-income residences. They don't have to comply with that particular element of the rule. That low-income exemption doesn't appear to exist anywhere else in other jurisdictions, and so we're going to need to remove that. The good news with that is that we also have an exemption for residences where wood burning is the sole source of heat. That is an exemption that is in place in other jurisdictions, so we think we can continue to include that exemption, and that will largely mitigate against folks who really have to rely on wood for heat in our region. We're also looking at lower permitting thresholds for confined animal facilities for our Rule 223. It looks like San Joaquin Valley has some provisions that are a bit more stringent than ours, and so we'll put those in place. Looking at lower thresholds for requiring emission controls for certain types of charbroilers in our 1138 rule. Again, it looks like San Joaquin Valley has some more stringent provisions that we'll be looking to include. And then to require composting of chipped and ground green waste before it's applied to land applications. Next slide, please. So when we conduct an attainment demonstration, the way we put this all together to show how we're going to meet the standard, we start off looking at our emissions inventory. We run that through a very complicated 3-dimensional air quality model, which then shows what those concentrations are. We can then figure out from that how much we need to reduce to be able to meet the standards. And then we circle that back to develop control strategies. Once we know how much we need to reduce, then we figure out where we need to get those reductions in our emission inventory. And that largely informs the development of our control measures. Next slide, please. All right, we're looking at our emission changes from 2018 through our year of 2030, which is a year we need to attain. You can see that emissions for NOx, they're going to go down by 54% over that time. And that's the large driver of our PM emission reductions we get. We'll have some modest emission reductions from direct PM 2.5, but that's, so it'll still continue to go down on the direct side, but it's not as important as driving down those NOx emissions, which will then lower the PM that's formed in the atmosphere. Next slide, please. And so when we apply all of this and we look at our base year versus our preliminary attainment scenario of what everything will look like in 2030, you can see in our base year, the orange columns, we're fairly high above the standard. For our Ontario Near Road Monitor is the highest at 14. Mira Loma also pretty high at 13.5. And then we have several other monitors also above the standard. But when we apply our attainment scenario, all of these monitors are now modeled to be below that 12 microgram per meter cubed. And so we show that we're able to meet that standard. Next slide, please. In terms of our public process, we have been meeting with advisory groups for the spring and the fall of 2023 to help inform the development of this plan. We're right now on the cusp of releasing a draft plan for public review and comments. We will be conducting our regional public hearings from April and May of this year. And then in May, we plan to release a draft of our socioeconomic plan regarding the impact of our plan. And then June is where we're considering bringing this plan to the board for their consideration, provided that that gets adopted. Then summer of 2024, the plan will go to CARB for its adoption and submittal to EPA. Next slide, please. In terms of the coming attractions, I mentioned that EPA recently strengthened the annual PM standard down to 9 microgram per meter cubed. We very much expect that we'll be designated as a non-attainment area, although that designation process will take a couple of years. We would be looking at an attainment date in 2036, or if we ask for that 5-year extension allowed under the Clean Air Act, push that out to 2041. We will need to adopt a new PM 2.5 plan for this by August of 2027. And we fully believe that the 2022 AQMP strategy by itself, even though it's very, very drastic, will not be sufficient to be able to meet that 9 microgram per meter cube standard. It's just a very stringent standard. So we'll be needing to look at additional controls. Next slide, please. All right, so just to wrap this up, we've developed this draft plan showing how we're going to be able to meet the 2012 annual standard by 2030 for PM 2.5. This plan will rely significantly on continued implementation of our 2022 AQMP and then some limited additional controls. Our public hearing and board adoption is slated for June of 2024, and a new plan with additional controls will eventually be required to be able to meet the new PM 2.5 standard. And with that, that concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Reese. Questions from the board members? Councilmember Rahman, Supervisor Mitchell? Okay, I think no questions at this time. Why don't we open this up for public comment? If the clerk can read the queue, please.
At this point, there are no hands raised, Chair.
Okay, we'll close the queue on public comment. So just remind us, what is the timeline moving forward on this one, Dr. Reese?
We'll be bringing this plan for board adoption in June of this year, and then we'll be shortly thereafter submitting it to CARB for a submission to EPA. We have a requirement to have this submitted to EPA by the end of this year in order to avoid sanctions.
And then I know there's this new standard that's coming that we're going to have to deal with. What about the other PM standards, the annual standards, et cetera? How are we doing on those?
Well, we already meet the older annual standard. That's the 1997 standard, and we've met that for over the last 10 years. And then the 2006 is the 24-hour standard. That's the one we brought to Mobile Source Committee a few years ago when we thought we were going to meet it then. At that time, we had a very bad year in terms of weather that was very perfect for formation of PM 2.5, as well as severe congestion at the ports. And so we didn't make the standard at that point. But right now, our preliminary data shows that we met that standard by the end of 2023. So we have to go through that work with EPA. But right now, it looks like we've met that 2006 24-hour standard.
And then are there other PM standards that we failed to meet other than the ones that we've discussed today? And
no other. Not on PM 2.5, no.
Okay. All right. So the short message is on PM 2.5, we're doing okay, although we're going to have a challenge with the new standard that was just approved.
We'll have a substantial challenge with the new standard. Otherwise, we're doing okay. We won't be alone in that substantial standard. A lot of California is going to be in the same boat with us.
Okay, well, thank you for helping put this in context with the other PM 2.5 plans. Sometimes it's hard to keep them all in mind. Other questions or comments from the board members at this time? Okay, thank you, Dr. Reese. We'll now go on to the next item. Is board member Rodriguez with us yet?
I don't see him.
Okay, because I know this was important to him. So let's make sure that, let's make sure he gets an update on this.
Chairman Krakoff, this is Mark Taylor's assistant. He had a conflicting work thing he had this morning, so he could not attend.
Okay, but Mark, you'll be sure to get this to him, and if there's comments from Board Member Rodriguez, I know he'll follow up with staff. Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Update. Thank you, Mark. Update on the warehouse actions and investments to reduce emissions WARE program. No motion required. This presentation will provide an update on the WARE program following the first 2 years of implementation, including the status of reporting by the regulated entities, actions and/or investments completed to comply with the rule, the amount of WARE points earned, compliance activities, and emissions reduced. And I think we have Vicki White, our Planning and Rules Manager.
Good morning, board member. This is Ian McMillan. Vicki White is unfortunately sick this morning, so I'll be, unfortunately for you all, filling in today to cover this update.
Okay, we'll tell her we hope she feels better, and you have big shoes to fill.
Yeah, well, she's definitely watching, so I'll try not to screw this up. First, I do want to note, I'm just also happy or honored to be here on, I think, Paul's last day as Mobile Source Committee, sitting right next to me, so try to send him off in some style here. So next slide, please. Just a quick bit of background. I'm not going to go through the details of this rule. That's happened a lot with this committee before, but just as a reminder, this rule was passed in May of 2021 by the board. It's really aiming to reduce NOx and diesel particulate matter emissions from mobile sources associated with warehouses. It has a phase-in period. All facilities will be phased in by 2025, and warehouse operators must submit annual compliance reports. So we'll be reporting in this presentation on some of those reports that have come in. At the last update we provided to committee, there was an interest to come back here in March with a mid-year update. Next slide. So just some of the things that have happened since that committee. First, US EPA has proposed approving this rule into the SIP. So again, as a reminder, we submitted this through CARB to EPA for their consideration for approval into the SIP. They didn't act as timely as they were supposed to under the Clean Air Act. So several environmental groups filed a lawsuit compelling EPA to act. They have a proposed consent decree now to take final action by July of this year. Along that path, EPA did put out a proposed approval of the rule as a SIP strengthening measure, which is exactly what we anticipated was going to happen. And the comment period ended last year. So we are eagerly looking forward to final action from EPA. Next slide. In addition, as I think folks know, there was litigation brought against this action, against the rule itself by the California Trucking Association. There were several interested parties who intervened on both sides of this litigation. In December of last year, the district court ruled in favor of South Coast AQMD and denied the plaintiff's claims, largely or completely upholding the justification that we provided for this rule. We have not seen an appeal to this decision. Next slide. So getting to the rule itself, just as a reminder, we've shown this slide in previous presentations, so we'll just a quick refresher. There's three main report types for this rule. There's the warehouse operations notification, they're in blue. That is a report that warehouse owners file to say just very basic information about the building they own and who are their tenants. Next, in green, is the initial site information report that would come next. That is the first report that warehouse operators would file, saying some details about their existing baseline operations at the facility and how they anticipate complying in the future with the rule. And then finally, in purple, there's annual reports. And these are the reports that show every year warehouse operators need to indicate how many points they earned under the rule, and in other words, how are they complying every single year. Next slide. So this timeline shown here, we have the same color scheme. So in green on top there, the initial site information reports going from left to right through time. We see the first phase came in 2022, then in 2023, middle of last year, and then we'll have another phase 3 coming in later this year. The different phases correspond to different size warehouses. Largest warehouses came in first, then medium size, then small. I say small, a small warehouse in South Coast AQMD is a 100,000 square foot building, so still quite large. We then have the phase in of the annual wear reports. They're in purple. And so we got the first reports at the beginning of last year, the second set of reports at the beginning of this year. And as we reported in September, we also initiated an enforcement initiative, and I'll be talking some more about that in later slides. Next. So just going through some of the phase-in or the implementation of this rule as it's being put into force. One of the things that the rule allows is it allows warehouse operators to take early action. And so they file these early action reports, and by doing that, they can take early extra credit and then bank those points for use in future years. What's shown here on this graph, the different colors represent the different phases in the rule. And the different bars from left to right show through time. And you see that these early actions are declining through time, which is expected. As of this year, they won't be able to file early actions because all phases will be required to earn points. So they won't be filing any more early action reports. So this is as expected, but we see it was an option that was used by many warehouse operators. Next slide. So this is a slide that really shows kind of in one piece, what is this rule doing as far as actions that are being taken. So the bars show the number of points being earned. And again, this is a menu-based points system for this rule where every action on a menu can earn a certain number of points. And every year, warehouse operators have to earn a certain number of points, and they can pick and choose off of that menu. And so all of the actions shown here are items on that menu or a mitigation fee. And you see that on the top bar, there's just about 250,000 points that were earned. That red indicates zero emission hostlers was a very common action that was chosen. Yellow showing near zero emission trucks. Those are the natural gas trucks. And then other colors there showing the proportion of points that were earned. You see in 2023, a lot more points were earned. And again, this is expected for two reasons. First, it includes now phase 2 is also earning points in calendar year 2023. And phase 1, the stringency of the rule increased. In other words, how much they have to do, that increased in the second year of implementation for phase 1. So we do see more points being earned. Again, zero emission hostlers, a popular item shown here, yellow, the near zero emission trucks. You see also the solar panel installation and usage really shows a very high number here, 15%. I do want to make a note, the footnote here, auditing is still underway. We believe there could be some misreporting in some of this, as happens in any kind of reporting program. So those audits will go underway, and these numbers may get corrected as a result of some of those audits. Next slide. So while the last slide showed points, really what I think is of a lot of interest is what are the real world impact. And so what's shown here are emissions and emission reductions rather. So on the left chart shows the nitrogen oxides, the NOx emissions reduced through time. And you see calendar year by calendar year, those emission reductions are increasing as the rule is getting phased in. So that's a good thing. Same color scheme here. The red is the zero emission hostlers. The yellow are the near zero emission truck visits. You see those are really where we're getting the bulk of the emission reductions. Not all menu items directly reduce emissions. So you can imagine, for example, zero emission charging infrastructure. Plugs, those don't directly reduce emissions, but they are a component of this rule. So all we're showing here are actions that directly reduce emissions. But one of the features of the rule too is that there's a lot of flexibility, a lot of different options. And part of that is that different options provide different benefits. So the same way that I described chargers, they don't necessarily provide that direct emissions benefit, but they're a really good facilitating measure. Some actions that do provide emission reductions, they provide it differently for NOx versus the right chart, diesel particulate matter. You get a much bigger reduction on diesel particulate matter from zero emission hostlers than you do on a NOx reduction. So you see the red increases a lot more for diesel particulate matter for those zero emission hostlers, which is a good outcome because those stay on site at these facilities. Overall, the benefits that we're seeing so far from the rule are in line with what we estimated we would be getting from this rule. And we expect that as compliance increases, the benefits are only going to increase. Next slide. This slide here shows a very detailed table with a lot of numbers. I'm not going to go through all of them, but we did want to put this out in this slide deck. There's a lot of public interest in the details of reporting, and the kind of information that's shown on this slide is something commonly requested. So we wanted to just provide this here that we could go back and point to. The data that's shown here is valid as of late February, continues to get updated, as you can imagine, as reports continue to come in. I'm just going to highlight a few of the notable actions that are shown on this. And really all we're showing here are zero emissions and really kind of focusing on zero emissions on this slide, both on the trucks, the chargers, the usage, the visits, et cetera. So in the middle of the table, you see zero emission hostler acquisition. There's 189 zero emission hostlers that were acquired to comply with the rule. That's across 96 different facilities. Those would not have been acquired but for this rule, as far as we can tell. These were not very commonly used prior to the rule, so it's a really good example showing where this rule is having an effect. And you can see that those hostlers are being used. So second row from the bottom, you see that's 1.7 million hours of total use across 130 facilities. So you notice that there's 96 facilities that acquired zero emission hostlers, but 130 that use them. That difference indicating the number of hostlers that existed prior to the rule, or that hostlers might have been acquired due to use of incentive funds that prohibited using incentive funds to comply with a rule. So there's, maybe a little bit of overlap between incentives and the rule itself, but we still allow usage to earn points in the rule. The other thing that I want to highlight here is the zero emission Class 8 truck visits. Again, kind of in the middle there's about 250,000 visits from zero emission Class 8 trucks at 185 facilities. One of the things that we're really trying to get at with this rule is to scale. And we see that, there's a lot of very successful demonstration projects that our agency has undertaken, some really interesting, sort of one-offs of projects that are really getting these trucks into place. But we have 3,000 or so warehouses that eventually will be covered by this rule. And what we're trying to do is scale and really increase. And so we're seeing just the start, just the beginning of that scaling. So 250,000 visits from zero emission trucks, that's a lot. To put it in context, though, there's a long ways to go. That's less than 1% of all visits to warehouses. So still a long way to go, but it gives an idea of the magnitude of what we're talking about here. Next slide. This slide is showing the zero emission chargers that have been installed and have earned points under the rule. So I believe there's 84 facilities that are shown here in yellow and in blue. Blue shows hydrogen infrastructure that's been installed. Yellow is the chargers and also TRU plugs. TRU plugs are only a handful of facilities here. Almost all of this is for on-road vehicles, trucks mainly. And so it's a really good start. It's one of the questions about chicken and the egg. Which do you do first, the trucks or the chargers? And I think everybody's discovering chargers need to come first. So it's really good to see that this pulse of activity is happening. We're anticipating this is going to continue through time as well. Next slide. Okay, this graphic that's shown here, it's a little bit complicated, so I want to walk through it. What it's showing in the dashed outline, you see on the left there, 1,039 facilities, warehouses, that's our estimate how many phase one warehouses there are. What's shown in the colors inside that dashed line, the green bar shows those initial site information reports, ISIRs. It shows how many have been submitted to us so far from what we have anticipated. In purple shows the year 1 annual wear reports, AWRs, and blue shows the year 2 annual wear report, AWRs. When we reported in September last year, I believe that purple bar was at about 45%. I think today it might be at about 55%. And so we've seen some increase, which is good, but certainly not where it needs to be. So I'll talk a little bit more about compliance later, but that compliance effort is continuing. When we get to phase 2, same kind of thing, but we see it's very similar, but slightly different number of warehouses are in phase 2, about 1,059 is our estimate. And we see that those initial site information reports, a lot more work needs to be done there to get facilities into the system. You see that purple bar, there's no purple bar there, but that's expected. They were not required to file reports for 2022. They only came in at first from last year, so that's the blue bar. About a quarter of facilities have filed those reports so far. Again, a lot more work needs to be done to bring all of these bars up. Next slide. What's shown here is looking not just at the number of reports that have been received, but looking at it in a different way, how many points needed to be earned. And again, the points again are the main compliance obligation under the rule. And so what's shown here is for phase 1, that left bar, we're showing the number of points is the vertical axis. The purple, you see there about 50,000, that is the compliance obligation. For all of phase 1, collectively, those facilities that have reported to us, they needed to earn about 50,000 points. But overall, they earned more than that. Again, there's that 247,000 number that we saw from an earlier slide. And we see that most of that was not from mitigation fees. The mitigation fees, that top little green slice, was a component, but most of it was from wear menu actions, direct actions that facilities are taking. Similar in 2023 for phase 1 and that next bar over, it's about 90,000 points was a compliance obligation. Again, far exceeding, well over 600,000 points were actually earned. These extra points that facilities are earning, they can bank that and use that for future years. And we think that facilities are going to be relying on this because, again, that stringency increases through time. So these banked points are going to be useful for those facilities that have earned those points. Phase 2 is shown there in the gray box, and you see the purple there is only 10,000 points. Again, this is a smaller number. Smaller number of facilities have reported to us so far. And then also their obligation is going to be a little bit less because their activity is less, their emissions are less. And so we're expecting less points to come out there, but that will definitely need to increase through time as reporting increases. Next slide. So I mentioned compliance activity and this enforcement initiative. So just a little summary here. So in fall last year in September, we did send out compliance advisory, and this is again after years of outreach to facilities. We report on that every month to this committee, all of the outreach that occurs, and that outreach continues. We stepped it up and said, okay, we sent a compliance advisory to those who are subject to the rule. We have also had, over 800 in-person site visits from both the outreach team as well as from inspectors, and that continues. I mean, this is as of late last month, but that outreach and those inspectors visiting will continue. About 200, a little bit more than 200 NOVs have been issued so far. Those are still in process. There's not much more I can say about it here, but that enforcement process continues with those facilities and with other facilities that have not yet filed their reports. So this dual effort of both enforcement and then compliance assistance to once those facilities have been identified, they've received an NOV, working with staff to get them into the system and back into compliance and to resolve all those NOVs, that will continue. Next slide. Just an indication of what this has looked like. The contact between the warehouse implementation team and regulated facilities. What's shown here on the green bar chart is the number of calls and emails that we receive every week. And we see that it's, kind of gone up and down through time, somewhat matching the enforcement initiative. You see these pulses, they actually align pretty well with some of that activity. We saw a big pulse early this year. That's also expected. That was right before a filing deadline. And we really tried to get the word out about that filing deadline. We got a lot of activity that we saw there. Every one of these calls and emails we do return as quickly as we can. So a lot of effort from staff, hundreds and hundreds of calls and emails and working with facilities to get their reports in. Next slide. So for next steps, of course, I mentioned we'll continue these enforcement efforts. A lot of outreach still needs to happen for phase 3 for both owners and operators. This is their first compliance year for having to earn points, and so we're continuing to outreach to them. A lot of auditing still needs to happen. Again, there's thousands of facilities. This takes time to go through the audits. So while we got some reports in January this year, and I'm reporting some of that information today, most of that information is not audited yet, and so that auditing function will continue, and we'll update numbers as appropriate. The WarePop reporting software, this is the software tool that all warehouse operators and owners need to file their reports through. There are no paper reports. They only file it through this. There's a lot of work that happens internally with our IM team and across multiple divisions to try to get this as functional as possible. It's a very, very good tool. We'll continue to update that as we go through. And then, of course, we have our more complete annual report we'll be doing later this year, and we will be bringing that back to Mobile Source Committee. That concludes my presentation and available for any questions.
When does it come back to Mobile Source?
We're looking at fall timeframe. I don't think we have an exact date yet, September, October, roughly.
Thank you. Questions from the committee members at this time?
Mr. Chair.
Supervisor?
Thank you. When will you know the outcome of the audit you referenced?
The auditing is an ongoing process. There's not
Okay.
just a single one audit, it's facility by facility. So that really is ongoing every year, all the time. So it's a continual update.
Thank you. And do you have any concern? I think if I'm tracking the slides correctly, there should be around 400 warehouses that haven't submitted anything, even with their phase 1 plan. Are you concerned about that?
Let me answer that, Supervisor. Yes, we're concerned about that. And we're working on a number of different fronts to address that, both with Bay and myself from the legal perspective, as well as with Mr. Terrence Mann, our Deputy for Enforcement and Compliance. I have had the chance to actually go out to a few of the facilities, and part of the challenge that we see right now is that there are some, very large facilities that are doing everything that they can to be in compliance. And part of the challenge that we've seen for these facilities is that they're doing the right thing, yet they may be facing other challenges, such as inability to get charging stations located in. And so they themselves feel as if they're in a way being penalized because others, and especially large number of others, are not in compliance or even moving toward compliance. So, from our perspective, no one should benefit from being in non-compliance. And those that are doing everything they can should be rewarded. So we're working diligently to address these shortfalls and trying to figure out what's the best way to resolve these situations. I hope to have much improved numbers over the next few months that we can bring back to the board for review.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Supervisor. Councilmember, anything at this time?
I caught a statistic that you mentioned when you were speaking, and I just wanted to clarify it. You said what percentage of the zero emission truck visits, so what percentage of the total number of truck visits are actually zero emission now?
Unfortunately, less than 1%.
Less than 1%. Wow. And what was the number in the slide for the total number of visits that are now?
I said it, and it's about 250,000
Wow.
visits have been
And-
reported so far.
And, I think I felt much the same about this presentation as I did the last time we heard some details about the ongoing implementation of this rule, this is really exciting. It feels like there's progress happening. The progress is slow and sometimes in fits and starts, but it has been steady. And we're achieving some of the goals that we set out through the rulemaking. I wondered whether you had any lessons that we can draw from this effort for the other ISR efforts that we're engaged in.
Ian, maybe I can start out and then you can backfill anything that I may have missed. Board Member Rahman, from my perspective, the biggest challenge, and Ian touched on this, is infrastructure. We find that, manufacturers for the zero emission heavy duty trucks can build the trucks, but more often than not, they don't have places to charge them because a facility can come in, they can be at the end of the circuit. They need to have a new substation, they need new transformers. And in the meantime, they have a very expensive truck, a $500,000 truck that they can't necessarily use.
Right.
And so one of the things that we're hearing a lot about is the Advanced Clean Truck program from CARB. And I know I raised that to Board Member Krakoff, that there are warehouse owners and operators that would like to talk about some of those aspects. But we're seeing, even in our demonstration projects, that infrastructure is the key. Delivering zero emission trucks that rely on diesel generators to charge is not what any of us had intended. And so we have to find ways to accelerate that. And that's where working with the utilities, working with the Energy Commission, working with the PUC, working with CARB, working with CCAs, I think it really demonstrates to us that we've got to do more to accelerate the infrastructure placement and really make sure that those investments in infrastructure are occurring. And it's not just at our level, it's the grid in its entirety. It's making sure that they carry the load, the increased load, that it has the strength and robustness to withstand that. We're talking about chargers that are 10 times larger than what we're looking at.
Right.
And being able to have the power, deliver the power reliably so that the supply chain can function as it's intended is the biggest challenge from my perspective. Ian, I don't know if you'd like to add anything.
No, I think on the zero emission infrastructure, I think, yeah, exactly. I think the only other lesson that I would take away here is one of the things that the warehouse rule has as a key feature is a lot of options. Provides flexibility to allow the different business models that are out there and the different kinds of operations, they can still comply, right? Because they have different options that are available to them. The kinds of options that are available here, does that exactly fit to every other warehouse, every other indirect source or facility type? Yes and no, right? I think we'll have to tailor it to other kinds of facilities, but the general idea that options are better, I think that still holds.
That's really, really great to know. And I appreciate the point about the infrastructure. Thank you.
Anything else from the board members at this time? So we've sent out some notices of violation, Ian.
That's correct.
And what's been the response on that?
I would say at this point, we're still working to resolve those. Part of the challenge is, some of the facilities vary and the timing varies. So some of them have not filed, some of them have not been aware, some of them hadn't filed, received the notice and filed. So we're working on those resolutions. That's something that, as I said earlier, Bay and I and the team, along with Terrence, are trying to really develop a more streamlined approach that will help us more quickly resolve these, and then hopefully make sure that the regulated community knows about those, so they will also sort of see firsthand that non-compliance does not serve them.
Right. And anything to discuss about the status of the litigation?
The warehouse litigation, the ISR litigation?
Correct.
I'll
No.
defer to Bay.
No, there isn't. I think the only update is what Ian mentioned before, and that there hasn't been an appeal. The time for that is passed. So that's the current status.
Thank you.
That's now the rule of the case.
So if we have NOVs out, it's a new rule. So, those folks that are responsive to the NOVs and doing their best to comply, I'm sure we'll use our enforcement discretion against them wisely. But for those folks that are not responding to NOVs, that's a whole other category. And this district's rules mean something, our NOVs mean something. And, folks that are not responding to NOVs, in my view, it's a whole different category of blatant noncompliance. So I know that our enforcement folks will keep that in mind and agree with your approach, Wayne, about getting out the word to the regulated community and doing our best. And hopefully, council member, every time we hear this, we'll be getting, more compliance, higher compliance rates, and also hopefully more EV truck visits and the rest of it each time we get this report. That's the whole design of the rule, correct?
Correct.
All right. We'll open this up to public comment at this time.
No one has their hand raised.
Thank you. We'll close public comment. And I know we talked about the status of the EPA waiver a little bit. Anything you want to add about that, EPA's approval of the rule? Anything to add?
No.
And what's the timing on that?
Ian, is it August?
It's supposed to be July. The proposed consent decree is July 17th this year.
To make an action on a final action?
Yes, for final action.
Okay, thank you. Anything further at this time, board members? Okay, we'll close this item number 2. That takes us to the remainder of the agenda. Written reports, item 3 through 7. These are, 3 and 4. These are just written reports, no presentation. Any comments or anything on these 2 board members? Hearing none, that takes us to other business. Anything on other business? Our next Mobile Source Committee meeting is in April. We expect updates on the indirect source rules at that time.
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, well, those are going to be an important meeting for sure. So everybody mark that on their calendar there, April 19th. We'll now go to general public comment for items not on the agenda. Item 6, we'll open the queue.
There's no one in the auditorium.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
we have one member of the public here, please. Let me get them on camera.
And we do have another person that's
Mitchell
raised their
and
hand.
technology. Mr. Chair, can he proceed?
We can't see them. No, just kidding, just kidding.
Right ahead.
Okay, we'll open the queue. Who's going to go first there? Okay, Thomas Jelenich, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair Krakoff. Thank you, Supervisor Mitchell, and other committee members. My name is Thomas Jelenich. I'm with Pacific Merchant Shipping Association. Just wanted to provide some brief comments on the working group meetings that Southwest has been holding regarding Port ISR. First, I want to offer my thanks for holding those working group meetings. We have been asking for those. I think one of the things that's really important about those meetings is having them in person. The quality of the discussion has been greatly improved. That being said, we still do have some concerns. Probably our biggest concern is that, we did specifically ask for a technical discussion to dive into questions on emissions. Unfortunately, these meetings were primarily dominated by discussions of mechanisms rather than emissions. In our feeling, that is sort of backwards. I think we need to be able to identify the missions, where there are opportunities to reduce emissions beyond existing adopted CARB rules, and then use that information to identify mechanisms. As an example, discussion of mechanisms like increasing the use of clean ships. That doesn't inform us on what emission reductions are possible without understanding what kind of ships those are, how they will perform. In fact, under EPA Tier 3 rules, we don't expect many of the emission reductions that were discussed in that by increasing those ships present because of limitations in the EPA Tier 3 rules and in limitations on technology. So I think diving into the emissions question needs to be the next step here. We will provide written comments after next week's Harborcraft meeting, and looking forward to participating to that. The only other comment I would add to this is, while the quality of the discussion was vastly improved, there was also insufficient time. The meetings were unfortunately too short for such complex issues. The meetings often provided some in-depth on one topic, and then the second topic ended up being circumscribed because of simply a lack of time. We really think we need more time to do this. I would encourage more meetings more often to do this. I know you guys are on a schedule. Doing it sooner rather than later is your best chance of preserving that schedule. These are hard issues. So thank you for your time this morning.
That's all for public comment here at Hall of Administration, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Supervisor. Thank you, Thomas. Wayne, we have another workshop coming up. Is there still one more?
Yes. We also have two people that have their hand raised.
Thank you. When is the next workshop?
I believe the next workshop is next week on Wednesday. Is that right, Ian?
It's on March 21st at 1 p.m. And we'll hold this down at the Port of Long Beach building. Again, the focus of this next working group meeting will be on Harborcraft. We're hoping to focus the discussion on Harborcraft related to container terminals, but we understand that the conversation might expand from there depending on who shows up.
Very good. Well, thank you for holding those. And I know that a US EPA administrator, Michael Regan, was in Los Angeles yesterday and went down to the Port of Los Angeles and met with Mayor Bass and Gene Soroka and others, talking about grant funding and the Clean Ports program. So hopefully we'll be getting some of that. And I know Mr. Jelinich and others are participating in that process. We'll now go to the queue online, starting with Mr. Etter.
Yes, good morning. Am I being heard?
Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you. My name's Harvey Etter. I'm speaking for myself and for the Public Solar Power Coalition and like-minded entities, individuals. We're for the immediate, total, equitable solar conversion of this district, this state, and this planet so we can survive the climate crisis and the fact that we've reached our ecological limits. I want to incorporate by reference a video I did on Soft White Underbelly in YouTube, 15 minutes from June of 22, homeless man Harvey, Santa Monica. Okay, you get a little bit of perspective, okay? Oh, okay, I wanted to make comments, Dr. Reese, on PM. We have heard the precursors you used a few months ago, you used to say a third of emissions from PM come from precursors. More recently, in a climate meeting 2 months ago, we used a 2/3 figure. Today, you use 75% from precursors. Okay, now, you say for PM, and we've been bringing this up for a couple of years, that they're moderate and severe, okay? NOx is 2/3 of this stuff. Precursors for NOx, and NOx is extreme, and that's the law. And our legal opinion is that this is covered by extreme, and that brings in all kinds of other sanctions, FIPS, other stuff. Okay, and I asked Kosiati, who's an attorney, and seemed to have some kind of sensitivities classification. These are standards, okay? and they take judicial notice and all this stuff, okay? And the deaths are coming from this. And we got big problems in River City. The state of California only recognized 7,500 deaths per year from air pollution. Lancet, in an 18 article, used 1.1 to 1.5 million per year. Okay, 2-3 years ago, based on 7 million for the world versus 10 million higher, and they're going. That's not including heat, which is another 5 to 10 million. About 40% of all deaths are climate related right now, or more. Okay, we got big problems. We got to address now. Equity. The 40% that's coming out of the White House and stuff, that it only goes to improve the emissions in areas so they have cleaner air there, maybe like Beverly Hills or Brentwood. Okay, well, the question is, who, key bono, who benefits, who control decision making, and it's owned by the local communities and labor, worker-owned co-ops, different types of models, okay? And that this has to be stopped. Instead of 40%, and just putting those systems in, who's going to own it? If it's owned.
Thank you, Mr. Etter. Is there another commenter? Yes, Fernando Gaitan, your turn.
Good morning, Chair Krakow. Fernando Gaitan with Earth Justice, and thank you so much for these meetings. They've been really insightful. I also want to thank staff, going back to the working group meetings that were held on the port indirect source rule. And thank staff for the organization there. I thought we had some very productive discussions, and I agree with Mr. Jelenic that having discussions at the same table, being face-to-face is important. I thought the meetings were actually held very well organized and helped to keep us on track to talk about the issues that we needed to talk about. Now, I'll remind the board that the call for these meetings actually came from some industry folks to talk about the technical aspects of the rule. And I appreciate staff's approach here, to really turn back to stakeholders and really delve into what types of technologies are out there to help us get to those emissions reductions. So a couple of things that I really agree with, and I hope that we get to hone in on in the meetings that are forthcoming. One is infrastructure. It's very clear that infrastructure will be an important piece of the rule. And we've actually seen that play out in the warehouse indirect source rule that we just learned about. It's significant to show that, when we have a problem like infrastructure, having a rule in place like the warehouse indirect source rule helps catalyze some of the solutions that we need around infrastructure. We've already seen 299 plugs available for heavy duty charging, according to the latest presentation we just had. And so it's clear to us that having the rule in place will help catalyze those solutions that we need to see moving forward. The second is, I agree that we need to talk about emission reduction targets, specific targets that are strong enough to give this rule at the port ISR some teeth, some weight, some significance. And so we hope to delve into those discussions as well. One thing I caution, however, is the call for more meetings. Yes, it is important, but we should not have that be a premise to delay this rule even further. I remind the board that this is a rule that's been in the works for practically a decade now. And so having this rule finalized in 2024 will be essential. And I strongly encourage both the Mobile Source Committee and the governing board to really help support staff to get this rule done this year. Thank you.
There are no other raised hands.
Sorry, we'll close the queue at this time. Thank you, Mr. Gaitan. And again, I believe this issue is coming back to the Mobile Source Committee for a comprehensive update on our April 19th meeting. And that is our last item here, is reminding folks about that April 19th meeting. So we'll see you all then. Anything further at this time? Okay. Nobody get too wild at St. Patrick's Day on Friday, okay, on Sunday. Thank you all so much. This meeting is adjourned.
Bye, everyone.